The last peaceful morning. The morning sun filtered through the bamboo shutters of Chun Wei's workshop, casting striped shadows across his oil-stained workbench. In the small village of Baolin, nestled in the mountains of southern China, the 52-year-old mechanic was known for one remarkable talent. He could fix anything. Tractors that hadn't run in years, water pumps declared dead by other repairmen, even the mayor's prized motorcycle. All had been resurrected by Chen's patient hands and ingenious mind. On this particular morning in the spring of 1944, Chun was hunched over a disassembled irrigation pump, its parts spread before him like the components of an intricate puzzle. His apprentice, young Liu, a 17-year-old boy with eager eyes and clumsy hands, watched intently as Chen's weathered fingers identified a hairline crack in a valve housing. "You see this, Liu?" Chun pointed with a screwdriver. "This tiny fracture is why the entire system fails. In mechanics, as in life, the smallest weakness can bring down the mightiest machine." Liu nodded, committing every word to memory. Chun was not just teaching him about engines and pumps. He was teaching him to think, to observe, to understand the fundamental principles that govern how things worked and how they could be made to work differently. The workshop smelled of grease, metal shavings, and the sweet scent of the plum trees that grew wild around the village. Tools of every description hung on the walls. Wrenches, hammers, saws, and implements Chun had fashioned himself for specific purposes no standard tool could address. In one corner sat his pride and joy, a complete set of textbooks on mechanical engineering, purchased years ago in Shanghai, before the war had reached their remote valley. Chun had studied those books until their spines cracked and their pages yellowed. He'd learned about leverage, force, combustion, and pressure. He understood springs, gears, hydraulics, and the explosive potential of various fuels. All of this knowledge had been applied peacefully in service to his community. The farmers relied on him to keep their equipment running. The village thrived because Chun could solve any mechanical problem. The peace of that morning was shattered by the sound Liu would never forget, the distant rumble of heavy machinery, growing steadily louder. Both Chun and Liu straightened, their hands still, their breath held. They had heard rumors, of course. Every refugee who passed through the village brought stories of the Japanese advance, of villages burned, of brutal occupations. But Baolin was so remote, so insignificant, that its residents had allowed themselves to believe they might be spared. Chen walked to the workshop door and looked down the valley. A column of dust rose from the mountain road, and emerging from it, like iron beasts from a nightmare, came 3 Japanese Type 95 Hago light tanks, their treads churning the dirt road. Behind them marched 50 soldiers, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. "Liu," Chen said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Go warn the village. Tell Mayor Zhang that the war has found us." The boy ran, his sandals slapping against the packed earth. Chen remained at the doorway, watching the approaching column. His mind, that remarkable instrument trained to solve mechanical problems, began working at a speed it had never achieved before. He thought about force and resistance. He thought about psychology and fear. He thought about every principle of engineering he had ever learned. By the time the tanks reached the edge of the village, Chun Wei had conceived of an idea. It was desperate, probably foolish, and certainly dangerous. But as he looked at the vulnerable wooden houses of Baolin, at the terrified faces beginning to appear in doorways and windows, he knew he had to try. His skills had always been devoted to building and repairing. Now, for the first time in his life, he would have to use them to destroy, or at least to create the illusion of destruction so convincing that trained soldiers would flee in terror. The village mechanic closed the door to his workshop and began to gather materials. The occupation begins. Within an hour, Baolin had transformed from a peaceful farming community into an occupied village. The Japanese commander, Captain Nakamura, had established his headquarters in the mayor's house, the largest building in the village. The 3 tanks were positioned strategically, one at the main entrance to the village, one near the well in the central square, and one at the mountain pass that led to the neighboring valley. Soldiers patrolled the streets, their expressions cold, their rifles ready. Chunwei watched from the window of his workshop, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. The workshop was at the edge of the village, near the rice paddies, which had perhaps saved it from immediate seizure. The Japanese seemed more interested in controlling the population and securing food supplies than in investigating every building. Mayor Zhang had been forced to provide a list of all village residents and their occupations. When the soldiers learned that Chun was a mechanic, 2 of them had visited his workshop, looking for tools or materials they might requisition. Chun had shown them his basic hand tools, concealing his more sophisticated equipment and, most importantly, his engineering textbooks. The soldiers had seemed satisfied and left, warning him in broken Chinese that he would be required to repair any military equipment that needed maintenance. As evening fell, the village gathered in frightened clusters, speaking in whispers. Families locked their doors early. The usual sounds of village life, children playing, neighbors chatting, dogs barking freely, were replaced by tense silence broken only by the boots of patrolling soldiers. Captain Nakamura had announced through an interpreter that Bao Lin would provide rice and vegetables to feed his troops. Any resistance would result in severe punishment. The village would remain under military control indefinitely. That night, Chun could not sleep. He lay on his cot in the small room behind his workshop, listening to the sentries walking past, their footsteps regular and disciplined. His plan was taking shape, but it required materials he didn't have, knowledge he would need to extrapolate from theory, and courage he wasn't certain he possessed. One mistake would mean death, not just for him, but possibly for the entire village in retaliation. At dawn, Chun began his work. He told Liu to stay away, insisting that the boy help his family in their rice paddy instead. "What I'm about to do, you cannot be part of," Chun said firmly. "If this fails, at least you will be innocent of any involvement." Liu wanted to argue, to insist on staying, but the seriousness in his master's eyes silenced him. The young man left reluctantly, looking back at the workshop where he had learned so much, wondering if he would ever see Chunwei alive again. Alone in his workshop, Chun began by taking inventory of everything he had. Metal pipes of various sizes, wire, batteries from broken flashlights and radios, chemicals, motor oil, gasoline, fertilizer from the farming supply he kept for maintaining agricultural equipment, various solvents and cleaners, tools for cutting, welding, and assembling, and something he had acquired months ago for a specific repair job and never used, a small quantity of magnesium strips, brilliant when ignited. Chen's plan was not to create an actual bomb capable of destroying the tanks. He knew that was beyond his capabilities and resources. The armor on those Type 95s, while not the heaviest in the Japanese arsenal, would still resist anything he could construct. But Chen had realized something crucial. He didn't need to actually destroy the tanks. He only needed to make the Japanese believe he could. The psychology of it was what mattered. If he could create a device that produced a sufficiently terrifying explosion, one that seemed far more powerful than a simple man in a village workshop should be capable of creating, the Japanese might conclude that the villagers had access to serious weaponry, perhaps supplied by Chinese resistance fighters or even American forces. They might decide that Bao Lin was not worth the risk. Chen spent the entire day working, pausing only when soldiers passed nearby. He fashioned a cylindrical container from metal piping, sealing one end with welded plate. Inside, he would combine gasoline, fertilizer-based oxidizers, and metal shavings. Not enough to create a truly destructive explosion, but sufficient to produce a massive fireball, tremendous noise, and the psychological impact of seeming destruction. Building the illusion. The second day of occupation brought new horrors. A farmer who had tried to hide his best pig was beaten in the village square, as an example. The man's cries echoed through Bao Lin, a reminder of the consequences of defiance. Chun heard them from his workshop and felt his resolve harden. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he continued his dangerous work. The device he was constructing was unlike anything he had built before. His entire career had been devoted to understanding how machines worked properly. Now he needed to understand how to make something work catastrophically, but in a controlled way. The explosion needed to be dramatic without causing casualties. Ideally, it would happen when only the tanks and soldiers were in a blast radius, sparing any villagers. Chun had identified his target, the tank positioned at the mountain pass. It was the most isolated of the three, away from residential buildings. The pass itself was narrow, with steep slopes on either side. An explosion that would be amplified by the terrain, echoing dramatically through the valley. More importantly, if the Japanese could be convinced that the pass was mined or that resistance fighters control the heights, they might decide to retreat rather than risk being trapped. The bomb's core was a cylinder about the size of a large thermos, constructed from thick iron pipe. Chun had carefully welded the bottom and created a threaded cap for the top, sealed with rubber gaskets to make it airtight. Inside, he layered his explosive mixture, fertilizer rich in nitrates, mixed with aluminum powder and magnesium shavings to create an incendiary effect. To this, he added containers of gasoline that would rupture in the explosion, feeding a massive fireball. The trigger mechanism was ingeniously simple, a modified battery-powered detonator from a car's ignition system, wired to a basic timer Chun constructed from an old alarm clock. But the real genius of Chen's design was in the enhancements for psychological effect. He embedded nails and metal fragments in the outer casing, not to harm people, but to create a distinctive whistling, shrieking sound as they flew through the air. He had read in his engineering books about the terror caused by German bombs during the war in Europe, how their sirens were designed specifically to frighten. His device would scream. Additionally, Chen prepared smoke canisters. These were simpler devices using phosphorus scraped from matches mixed with oils that would produce thick, billowing clouds of black and white smoke. When detonated alongside the main charge, they would create the impression of a much larger, more sophisticated explosive device than it actually was. On the evening of the second day, Chun had a visitor. Mayor Zhang slipped into the workshop after dark, his face haggard with worry. "Chun Wei, I know you're planning something," he said without preamble. "People have seen you gathering materials. They've noticed you're not acting normally." Chun set down the screwdriver he'd been using. "Mayor, the less you know, the safer you'll be if I'm caught. Whatever you're planning, don't do it," Zhang pleaded. "Captain Nakamura has already threatened collective punishment if there's any resistance. If you attack them, they'll kill 10 villagers for every soldier harmed. Is that what you want?" Chun met the mayor's eyes steadily. "I'm not planning to harm their soldiers. I'm planning to scare them. There's a difference." "Scare them how?" Chun explained his plan. As he spoke, the mayor's expression shifted from fear to disbelief to cautious hope. When Chun finished, Zhang was silent for a long moment. "It's insane," the mayor finally said. "The chances of this working are small." Chun interrupted. "I know, but what are our chances if we do nothing? How long before they grow bored and start taking our daughters? How long before someone's resistance triggers a massacre? At least this way, we're taking action on our own terms." Zhang rubbed his face with both hands. "If you're caught building this thing, they'll execute you immediately. They'll probably execute others too, as a warning. Then I won't get caught." Chen's voice was calm, confident in a way that surprised even himself. "Mayor, I've spent 50 years learning how things work. Machines, mechanisms, systems, they all follow rules. And so do people, even soldiers. They follow rules of psychology, of fear, of self-preservation. I'm betting that their instinct for survival is stronger than their orders to hold this village. And if you're wrong," Chen smiled sadly, "then at least I'll die knowing I tried to protect my home." The messenger. On the third day, Chen's plan required a new element: information. For his scheme to work, the Japanese needed to believe that Baolin was not merely a helpless village, but potentially connected to larger resistance forces. They needed to believe that attacking the villagers would bring consequences from well-armed fighters hidden in the mountains. This is where young Liu would play his part, though the boy didn't know it yet. Chen had noticed that Liu had become friendly with one of the younger Japanese soldiers, a private named Tanaka, who had been assigned to guard duty near Chen's workshop. Tanaka, unlike many of his comrades, seemed uncomfortable with the occupation. He was polite, almost apologetic in his interactions with villagers. Chen had observed him sharing cigarettes with Lu and attempting to communicate through gestures and broken phrases. Chen called Lu back to the workshop that morning. "I need you to do something important," he said. "But you must do it naturally, without seeming deliberate." He explained carefully. Lu was to have a conversation with Private Tanaka. In that conversation, he should seem frightened, worried. He should mention, as if letting something slip accidentally, that his uncle had been a soldier with the Chinese Nationalist Forces, and that his uncle had spoken of resistance groups in these mountains, groups that had weapons, even explosives. Lu should seem to catch himself, as if realizing he'd said too much, and asked Tanaka not to mention it. "But master, it's a lie," Lu protested. "I don't have such an uncle." "The best lies contain some truth," Chen replied. "There are resistance groups in these mountains. That much everyone knows. We're simply suggesting a connection that doesn't exist. The point is to plant a seed of doubt in the Japanese minds. When the explosion happens, they'll remember this conversation and interpret it as confirmation of hidden fighters." Lu understood, though his hands shook as he left to find Tanaka. Chen watched from his window as the boy approached the young soldier. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Lu's performance was better than Chen had hoped. His nervousness was real, which made it entirely convincing. At one point, he glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Tanaka leaned in, listening intently. When Lu hurried away, the soldier stood for a long moment, clearly troubled, before resuming his patrol. That afternoon, Chen noticed increased activity around the Japanese command post. Tanaka had reported the conversation, exactly as Chen had hoped. Through his window, Chen saw Captain Nakamura consulting maps with his officers, pointing toward the mountains, his expression serious. The seed was planted. Now Chen worked with renewed urgency. His device was nearly complete, but he faced a critical challenge: delivery. He couldn't simply walk up to the tank and place the bomb. He needed a method that would allow him to position the device without being caught, and that would give him enough time to retreat to safety before detonation. The solution came to him while watching a water buffalo pulling a cart. The mountain pass where the targeted tank was stationed was the only road connection between Baolin and the neighboring valley. Every day, villagers used this pass to transport goods, moving between the valleys. The Japanese had established a checkpoint at the tank, searching carts and people passing through, but they had grown somewhat routine in their inspections after 3 days of finding nothing suspicious. Chen requisitioned a broken cart from Old Man Wong, claiming he needed it for spare parts. Instead, he reinforced it, creating a false bottom between the axles. The space was just large enough to hide his device. He loaded the cart with vegetables, cabbage, radishes, carrots, and covered the false bottom with a layer of straw and produce. To casual inspection, it would appear to be an ordinary market cart. The timer mechanism was Chen's greatest challenge. It needed to be reliable, but not so sensitive that a bump in the road would trigger early detonation. After much trial and error, using springs and counterweights, he developed a system that required a specific sequence of actions to arm. A pin needed to be removed, allowing a spring-loaded contact to slowly extend over exactly 30 minutes, at which point it would complete the circuit to the detonator. On the evening of the third day, Chen performed multiple tests with dummy circuits, ensuring the timing was precise. Everything had to work perfectly. He would have only one chance. As night fell, Chen sat in his workshop, the completed device before him. It looked innocuous, just a metal cylinder with wires, nestled in its hiding place beneath the false floor of the cart. In his hands, he held the arming pin. Pull this pin while the device was in place, and in 30 minutes, his village's fate would be decided. Chen thought of his wife, dead these 10 years from illness. He thought of the students he'd taught over decades, all the young people who'd learned their trades in this workshop. He thought of the village itself, the life he'd built here, the community that had been his world. Tomorrow, he would either save it all or condemn it. He didn't sleep that night. The journey to the pass. Dawn broke cold and gray over Baolin. Chen Wei had been awake for hours, making final preparations. The cart with its deadly cargo stood ready, covered by its innocent-looking load of vegetables. He had dressed in his most worn and ragged clothes, wanting to appear as just another poor farmer, beneath notice or suspicion. At breakfast time, Lou appeared at the workshop door. The young man had dark circles under his eyes. He too had not slept. "Master, I'm coming with you," he said firmly. "Absolutely not," Chen replied. "I told you. I know what you're planning," Lou interrupted. "I'm not a fool, and I've been your apprentice for 3 years. I know what you can build and what you've been building. If you're going to do this, you need someone to help, someone to distract the guard at the checkpoint while you do what you need to do." Chen wanted to refuse, to order the boy away, but he recognized the determination in Lu's eyes. It was the same determination he'd seen in the mirror that morning. And Lu was right. Having a second person, particularly an innocent-seeming teenager, would make the deception more convincing. "Very well," Chen said finally. "But you must follow my instructions exactly. When I tell you to run, you run. No hesitation, no looking back." "Understood." Lu nodded solemnly. They set out mid-morning, joining a small group of villagers also heading toward the pass. This was crucial to Chen's plan, appearing as part of ordinary traffic rather than a suspicious lone traveler. An elderly woman, Mrs. Chu, was taking eggs to her daughter in the next valley. The blacksmith's son, young Feng, was transporting tools for repair. Together, they formed a small convoy of innocuous commerce, the kind that had passed through the checkpoint dozens of times in recent days. The walk to the pass took 40 minutes. Chun pushed the cart, his weathered hands steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Lu walked beside him, carrying a basket of greens, playing his role of obedient apprentice. They talked quietly about inconsequential things, repairs that needed doing, weather predictions, gossip from the village, all performed for any ears that might be listening. As they approached the checkpoint, Chun could see the Type 95 Hago tank positioned to one side of the road, its barrel pointing down the pass. 3 soldiers manned the checkpoint, with another 2 visible inside the tank. Captain Nakamura had been thorough in his deployment. This position controlled all traffic between the valleys. "Remember," Chun whispered to Lu, "be natural. You're just a boy helping his master. Nothing unusual." The first test came quickly. One of the soldiers, a Sergeant Chun had seen before, raised his hand to halt the group. He was a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, the kind who enjoyed the small authority his position granted. He began with Mrs. Chu, roughly handling her egg baskets, breaking several eggs in the process just to demonstrate his power. The old woman bit her lip but said nothing, knowing that protest would bring worse treatment. Next came the blacksmith's son. The sergeant poked through the tools, confiscating a good hammer for military use, he claimed, though everyone knew he would likely sell it. Young Feng's jaw clenched, but he too remained silent. Then it was Chen's turn. The sergeant approached the vegetable cart, and Chun felt his pulse quicken. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The false bottom was well constructed, but if the soldier decided to unload everything, if he examined the cart too closely— "What's this?" the sergeant demanded in rough Chinese, gesturing at the cart. "Vegetables, sir," Chen replied, keeping his voice humble, his eyes downcast. "For market in the next valley. Cabbage, radishes, carrots. Would you like some? I can offer them to the honored soldiers as a gift." The offer of a bribe, disguised as generosity. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, but Chen saw interest there. "Show me," he ordered. This was the critical moment. Chen began lifting out vegetables from the top layer, handing them to Lu, who placed them carefully on the ground. The sergeant watched, then poked his rifle into the remaining produce, stirring it around. Chen's heart pounded so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. The false bottom was less than a foot below the surface. "Lu," Chen said suddenly, loudly, "be careful with those. Don't damage the goods." It was a calculated distraction. Lu, understanding immediately, fumbled with an armload of cabbages, dropping several. They rolled across the checkpoint, one bumping against the sergeant's boot. The soldier's attention shifted from the cart to the clumsy boy. "Stupid!" he barked at Lu, who scrambled to collect the fallen vegetables, apologizing profusely, creating chaos and distraction. In that moment, while the sergeant was focused on Lu, the other soldiers were laughing at the boy's clumsiness, and attention was diverted, Chun made his move. His hand slipped beneath the straw at the bottom of the cart, finding the arming pin. In one smooth motion, practiced 100 times in his workshop, he pulled it free. The device was armed. The timer was running. 30 minutes. The wait. Enough, the sergeant shouted. He kicked one of the cabbages back toward Liu. Take your vegetables and go, but leave the best ones for the Imperial Army. Chen quickly selected several large cabbages and fine radishes, presenting them to the sergeant with a low bow. The soldier grunted, satisfied with his tribute, and waved them through. Chun resumed pushing the cart, his hands somehow steady despite the knowledge that beneath the vegetables, beneath the false floor, a timer was slowly clicking toward detonation. 28 minutes remaining. They proceeded through the checkpoint, past the tank, and began the descent on the far side of the pass. Mrs. Chu and young Feng were ahead of them. Chen maintained a normal pace, not too fast, not too slow. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the bomb. But he forced himself to stay calm, to preserve the illusion of normalcy. Once they were around the first bend, out of sight of the checkpoint, Chun stopped. Liu, he said quietly, I need you to go on ahead with the others. Tell them there's been a slight delay, that we'll catch up shortly. Liu looked at him, understanding and fear mingling in his young eyes. Master what? Go, Chen said firmly. Get over the ridge and down into the valley. Stay with the others. What happens next, you cannot be near. For a moment, the boy hesitated. Then, without another word, he ran to catch up with Mrs. Chu and Feng. Chen watched until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to his cart. Working quickly, he pushed it off the road into a dense thicket of bamboo. The cart would be invisible from the pass above, but the explosion would still be clearly audible and visible to the soldiers at the checkpoint. 23 minutes remaining. Chun had carefully calculated this part. He needed to be far enough away to be safe from the blast, but close enough to observe the results and, if necessary, to respond to unexpected developments. He found a position on the hillside opposite the pass, behind a large boulder that would shield him from shrapnel while giving him a clear view of the checkpoint above. As he settled into position, Chen's mind raced through everything that could go wrong. The timer might fail. The detonator might not spark. The mixture might not ignite. Or, worst of all, it might work too well, causing casualties he never intended. He had designed the device to be more sound and fury than actual destruction. But explosives were unpredictable. Despite all his calculations, all his careful engineering, there was no certainty. 20 minutes remaining. At the checkpoint above, life continued normally. Chun could see the soldiers lounging near the tank, smoking cigarettes, relaxed in their routine. One was eating something from a tin. Another was examining the hammer he'd confiscated from young Feng, testing its weight and balance. They had no idea that their world was about to change. Chen thought about those soldiers. They were men like him, following orders, caught up in a war they might not have chosen. Some, like Private Tanaka, seemed decent enough. But decent or not, they had invaded his village, threatened his people, and brought fear and suffering to Baolin. Whatever sympathy Chun might feel for them as individuals could not override his duty to protect his community. 15 minutes remaining. A light rain began to fall, barely more than mist. Chun pulled his jacket tighter. The moisture might affect the explosion, dampening the fire effect. Or it might not. Too late to worry about that now. The pin was pulled, the timer was running, and there was no way to stop it. Chun Wei had committed himself and his village to this course of action. 10 minutes remaining. Chen's thoughts drifted to his workshop, to the peaceful life he had known. How strange that a man who had spent his entire life fixing things should end up building something designed to break, to destroy, to terrify. Yet wasn't there a kind of logic to it? Understanding how systems worked meant understanding how they could be disrupted. Every engineer knew that the same principles that created could also destroy. 5 minutes remaining. The rain stopped. A beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the mountain pass. Chen found himself hoping that his calculations were correct, that the blast would be spectacular but not deadly, that it would achieve its purpose without bloodshed. He had spent 3 days building a device whose success would depend on psychology rather than explosive power, on creating an impression, an illusion, a moment of terror sufficiently convincing to make trained soldiers abandon their position. 3 minutes remaining. Chun whispered a prayer to ancestors he wasn't entirely sure he believed in. He thought of his wife, gone these 10 years, and wondered what she would think of what he was about to do. She had always believed in him, in his clever hands and creative mind. "You can solve anything," she used to say. "You just need to understand how it works." 2 minutes remaining. At the checkpoint, one of the soldiers stood up, stretching. He said something to his companions, and they laughed. So ordinary, so normal, so unaware. In moments, their sense of safety would shatter. 1 minute remaining. Chen held his breath, his eyes fixed on the bamboo thicket where his device waited. 30 seconds. 20. 10. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. The world exploded. The deception. The blast exceeded even Chen's calculations. The confined space of the mountain pass acted as an amplifier, focusing and channeling the explosive force. The initial detonation created a thunderous boom that echoed across the valley, rolling like continuous thunder. Instantly, a massive fireball erupted from the bamboo thicket, orange and red flames shooting 30 feet into the air, fed by the gasoline Chun had included in his mixture. But it was the secondary effects that made the deception truly convincing. The metal fragments embedded in the casing whistled and shrieked as they flew through the air, creating an unholy wail that sounded like incoming artillery. The smoke canisters detonated a half-second later, producing billowing clouds of black and white smoke that rolled up the hillside toward the checkpoint, obscuring visibility and adding to the chaos. From his vantage point behind the boulder, Chun watched the soldiers' reaction. It was everything he had hoped for. They scattered immediately, diving for cover. The men inside the tank disappeared, sealing the hatches. Shouts of alarm filled the air, barely audible over the ringing aftershock of the explosion. Then Chun played his final card. He had brought with him 2 additional smoke canisters, smaller devices he could light manually. As the smoke from the main explosion began to clear, he lit these secondary charges and threw them onto the hillside below his position. They ignited, producing more smoke, creating the impression of multiple explosion points, suggesting a coordinated attack from hidden positions. Through the smoke, Chun could hear the tank's engine roar to life. The turret swung back and forth, searching for targets. Soldiers fired their rifles blindly into the hills, their shots echoing through the pass. But there was nothing to shoot at, only smoke, echoes, and the terrifying impression of an overwhelming attack by forces they couldn't see or count. Captain Nakamura's voice cut through the chaos, shouting orders in Japanese. Chun didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear: urgency, concern, possibly fear. More soldiers appeared from somewhere beyond Chen's line of sight, perhaps a patrol that had been farther down the pass. The checkpoint was now a scene of controlled panic, with men taking defensive positions, weapons pointed in all directions, searching for an enemy that didn't exist. Chun remained perfectly still behind his boulder, barely breathing. This was the most dangerous moment. If the Japanese decided to send patrols up the hillsides to hunt for the attackers, they might find him. If they discovered the cart with its crude bomb casing, they would realize the deception. Everything depended on their next decisions being made quickly, in the heat of the moment, based on fear rather than careful analysis. Minutes passed. The smoke began to clear. Chun could see the soldiers moving more cautiously now, establishing a defensive perimeter. The tank remained in position, but its engine was running, ready to move. Officers were conferring, pointing at the hillsides, gesturing toward the village. Then came the sound Chun had been waiting for, another engine starting. One of the tanks from a village was coming up to reinforce the checkpoint. Chun smiled grimly. Perfect. The more resources the Japanese committed to defending this pass, the more they would be convinced of the threat's seriousness. The second tank arrived within 10 minutes, accompanied by additional soldiers, perhaps 20 men. Captain Nakamura was now at the checkpoint personally, surveying the scene. Through his field glasses, Chun could see the officer examining the blast site, the scorch marks on the road, the scattered metal fragments. Nakamura's expression was grim. A soldier approached Nakamura, gesturing urgently and speaking rapidly. Chun recognized him. It was Private Tanaka, the young soldier who had spoken with Liu. Tanaka was clearly agitated, reporting what Liu had told him about resistance fighters in the mountains. Nakamura listened, then nodded slowly, his face hardening with decision. The captain issued a series of sharp commands. Soldiers began moving with purpose, no longer searching the hillsides, but instead preparing to evacuate. They were withdrawing. Chin's heart leaped. His impossible plan was working. But then something unexpected happened. A group of soldiers started moving down the road toward the village, moving quickly, their weapons ready. Chin's blood ran cold. Were they going to take revenge on Baolin? Had his attack simply provoked retaliation against the innocent villagers? Chun watched helplessly as the soldiers disappeared around the bend toward the village. He had to know what was happening. Carefully, staying low, he began working his way along the hillside, using the terrain and vegetation for cover. It took him 30 minutes to reach a position where he could see down into Baolin. What he saw filled him with relief and vindication. The Japanese weren't attacking the village. They were evacuating it. The third tank was already moving out, followed by soldiers in organized columns. They were loading supplies onto trucks with military efficiency, clearly preparing for a complete withdrawal. Liberation. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese had abandoned Baolin entirely. From his position on the hillside, Chun watched the last soldiers march away down the valley road, their withdrawal covered by the tanks. Captain Nakamura was taking no chances. He clearly believed that the village was too exposed, too vulnerable to attack by guerrilla forces that possessed explosives and controlled the surrounding heights. The psychology had worked perfectly. A military force trained to face enemies in open combat found themselves suddenly confronting an invisible threat, hidden fighters who could strike from concealment with devastating weapons. The cost of holding a minor village had suddenly become too high. Better to withdraw, consolidate forces, and avoid an ambush or prolonged guerrilla engagement in unfavorable terrain. When Chin finally descended to the village, he found its residents emerging from their homes in stunned disbelief. Children who had been hidden indoors for 3 days ran into the streets. Women embraced, crying with relief. Men stood in small groups, talking excitedly, trying to piece together what had happened. Mayor Zhang saw Chen approaching and hurried over, his face a mixture of joy and suspicion. "Chen Wei," he said quietly, drawing the mechanic aside, "that explosion at the pass, that was no resistance attack, was it?" Chen met the mayor's eyes. "What matters is that they believed it was. They're gone, Mayor. The village is free. But if they come back with more forces..." "They won't," Chen said with certainty. "They'll report that this area is controlled by guerrilla fighters with explosives and prepared defensive positions. The Japanese are stretched thin across China. They can't afford to commit the resources necessary to pacify every mountain valley, especially when they face real resistance elsewhere. We're not worth the cost." Liu appeared, running up to Chun with tears streaming down his face. "Master, you're alive. I heard the explosion, and I was so afraid." Chun embraced his apprentice, feeling the young man's shoulders shake with relieved sobs. "I'm fine, Liu. We're all fine. And you played your part perfectly. That conversation with Private Tanaka was crucial. You planted the seed of doubt that made my deception believable." Over the following hours, the story emerged. Villagers who had watched the Japanese departure reported that Captain Nakamura had seemed genuinely frightened, ordering his men to withdraw rather than risk further attacks. Some soldiers had spoken of mountain rebels and hidden explosives. The myth that Chun had created with wire, chemicals, and engineering knowledge had taken root and grown, becoming a reality in the Japanese soldiers' minds. That evening, as the sun set over Baolin, the village held an impromptu celebration. There was no formal feast. The Japanese had taken most of the stored food, but people gathered in the square, sharing what little they had, rejoicing in their unexpected liberation. Children played freely for the first time in days. Music returned to the streets. Life, so suddenly disrupted, began flowing again in its natural channels. Chen sat outside his workshop, watching the celebration but not joining it. He felt the weight of what he had done, the risk he had taken, the potential consequences if his gamble had failed. He thought about the fine line between cleverness and catastrophe, about how easily his plan could have gone wrong. Lu sat down beside him, offering him a cup of rice wine someone had produced from a hidden cache. "You're a hero, Master," the young man said. "You saved us all." "I'm not a hero," Chen replied quietly. "I'm a mechanic who got lucky. The device could have failed. The Japanese could have investigated instead of fleeing. One wrong calculation, and instead of celebrating, we'd be burying the dead. But it did work. Your calculations were right." Chen sipped the wine, feeling its warmth spread through him. "This time. But Lu, I want you to understand something important. What I did was use knowledge for destruction, or at least the illusion of destruction. It succeeded, yes. But the same principles that saved us today could be used to harm innocent people tomorrow. Engineering, mechanics, the understanding of how things work, these are powerful tools. They can be used to build or to destroy, to help or to harm. The choice of how to use them is what defines us." "I understand, Master." Lu was quiet for a moment. "Will you teach me? Not just about engines and pumps, but about everything? How to think like you think, how to solve problems the way you do." Chen looked at his young apprentice, seeing in him a hope for the future, a continuation of knowledge and skill that could outlive this terrible war. "Yes," he said, "I'll teach you everything I know. But always remember, our skills are meant to serve life, not death. This one time, I used them differently because there was no choice. But that should never be our purpose." Mayor Zhang approached, looking more relaxed than Chen had seen him in days. "Chen Wei, the village wants to honor you. They want to name the square after you, or put up a monument." "No," Chen interrupted firmly. "No monuments, no honors. What I did should remain quiet. If word spreads, it invites questions and investigations. Better that the story remains vague. Mountain rebels, hidden explosives, nobody quite sure what happened. Let be a mystery. But the people want to acknowledge. Let them acknowledge by rebuilding, by returning to their lives, by remembering that sometimes survival requires both courage and creativity." Chun stood up, stretching his weary muscles. "That's enough monument for me." In the weeks that followed, Baolin began to heal. Farmers returned to their fields. The market reopened. Chen's workshop once again rang with the sounds of productive repair work, fixing tractors, mending pumps, keeping the machinery of peaceful life running smoothly. Lu proved to be an even more dedicated student, having learned not just about mechanics, but about the power of knowledge, the importance of thinking clearly under pressure, and the value of using skills for the community's benefit. The Japanese never returned to Baolin. Reports filtering through from other areas confirmed Chen's prediction. The occupying forces had concluded that the mountain valleys were too dangerous, too costly to control. They focused their resources elsewhere, leaving the remote villages to the guerrilla fighters they believed controlled the heights. Years later, when the war finally ended and China began its long recovery, the story of Baolin became a local legend. People spoke of the mysterious explosion that drove away an entire garrison, of the hidden fighters who protected the village, of the inexplicable decision by Japanese forces to abandon a perfectly defensible position. But those who knew the truth, Mayor Zhang, Young Lu, and a few others, kept the secret. Chen Wei never built another weapon. He returned to his true calling, using his skills and knowledge to maintain and repair, to help and to heal. But sometimes, late at night, alone in his workshop, he would take out the engineering textbooks that had taught him the principles he'd used to save his village. He would run his fingers over the pages, remembering that desperate spring when theory became practice, when abstract knowledge became the tool of survival. And he would think about the profound responsibility that comes with understanding how things work, the power it grants, and the wisdom required to use that power well. In the end, Chen Wei's greatest creation wasn't a bomb or a deception or a clever mechanism. It was the lesson he taught his village, his apprentice, and himself. That knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that cleverness without conscience is empty, and that the highest purpose of skill is not in what it can destroy, but in what it can protect and preserve. The homemade bomb that scared off Japanese tanks was never found. The cart that concealed it rotted away in the bamboo thicket reclaimed by nature. But its impact echoed through the years, a reminder that sometimes the smallest communities, armed with nothing but ingenuity and courage, can stand against overwhelming force and win.